Welcome to Dreamer's Realm. I invite you to join me for a handful of tender stories drawn from ordinary days. May these quiet moments bring a smile to your soul or gently guide you into restful sleep. So get cozy, take a deep breath, and let's begin.
Story 1. The Harbor Boss. Tales of Captain Whiskers. Mendocino was the kind of town where time walked slower than everywhere else. Tucked along the rugged coastline of Northern California, the harbor was small, quiet, and bathed in salty air and morning fog. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other without needing to know names. Where fishermen knew the exact hour the tide would change just by watching the seagulls. And right at the heart of this slow-moving town lived a cat, but not just any cat. They called him Captain Whiskers, though no one remembered exactly who said it first. Some folks still referred to him as the Harbor Boss, because, in truth, that's what he was. He had no known owner. Some said he showed up after a storm one year, soaking wet and meowing like a drunk sailor. Others believed he'd always been here, like the tide, like the fog, like the sound of boats gently knocking against the docks. Captain Whiskers wasn't sleek or elegant like city cats. He was big, round, and unapologetically fluffy. His fur was a patchwork of whites and faded oranges, weathered like the wooden boards he liked to nap on. His belly swayed when he walked, a soft pouch of dignity earned from years of well-fed afternoons. But it wasn't just his looks that earned him the title. It was the way he walked the harbor. Every morning, as the sun stretched out across the Pacific, he made his rounds, from the far end of the boat sheds to the fish market stalls. He strutted with a sailor's swagger, as if inspecting his domain. He'd pause at certain boats, jump up onto the deck, sniff a coil of rope, or blink slowly at a fisherman having his morning coffee. No one stopped him, no one questioned him. If anything, people waited for him. Morning, Cap, old Gus would greet, tossing a bit of smoked salmon from his stand. Captain Whiskers would pause, assess the offering with what could only be called professional dignity, then eat it with the slow appreciation of a true connoisseur. Once finished, he'd swish his tail, give a nod, or perhaps an accidental head bob, and move on to his next post. Kids loved him. Tourists took his picture. Locals made sure he always had a shady spot in summer and a box of blankets in winter. Someone even crocheted a little sailor's cap and, to everyone's surprise, he didn't protest when they placed it gently on his head. From then on, the legend grew. Captain Whiskers wasn't just a cat. He was a symbol, a guardian of tide and time, a slow, purring presence in a world that moved too fast. And if you asked anyone in Mendocino, they'd tell you, he kept the seagulls in check. He sat beside the harbor master during storm warnings, calm as ever. He somehow knew when a new boat arrived, even before the Coast Guard, and perhaps, most beautifully. He knew when someone needed him. There was the day Ellie, the florist's daughter, came crying to the dock after her grandmother passed. She didn't want to go home. She didn't want anyone to see her sob. She sat near the edge of the wooden walkway, legs pulled up to her chest, tears mixing with salt air. And out of nowhere, Captain Whiskers appeared. He didn't rub against her. He didn't meow or beg for attention. He simply plopped down beside her, the way cats do when they decide to keep you company without asking. He stayed for over an hour. Didn't leave until she finally stood up and whispered, "Thank you." Or the time a fisherman named Pete returned from the sea empty-handed for the 4th time that month. He slumped down by his boat, head in his hands. The sea was changing. The fish were harder to find. His back ached more than it used to. And the bills were piling up. Captain Whiskers climbed aboard the old boat without hesitation. Sat right on Pete's lap. Heavy, warm, real. Pete laughed. "First time in days. You think I should keep going?" "Huh?" he asked. The cat blinked slowly, yawned, and licked his paw. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. But Pete decided to go out again the next morning. People started saying the cat had a gift. Not magical, not spooky, just something quiet, something knowing. He'd curl up beside the tired, sit with the lonely, occasionally paw at someone's foot like he was reminding them to stay grounded. And always, he watched the sea with eyes like little lanterns, deep, amber, and impossibly steady. As years passed, the town changed a little. Some boats were replaced with newer models. Some stores closed, others opened. Kids grew up. A few locals moved away. And new folks moved in. But Captain Whiskers remained. A fixture. A friend. A legend. He had a designated chair under the umbrella outside Marina Joe's cafe. No one sat there, not even in rain. It was his. Tourists would try, get politely redirected. "That's the boss's spot," someone would say. Even the local paper wrote a feature. The furry mayor of Mendocino. He didn't read it, of course. He was too busy sunbathing. When winter came one year with more ferocity than usual, people noticed Captain Whiskers wasn't making his usual rounds. Concern grew. Had he found a new hiding place? Had he moved indoors? It turned out, he was staying with Maggie, the retired schoolteacher. He'd wandered into her home during a storm. Dripping wet and shivering, she let him in, of course. Like anyone would. But this time, instead of leaving after a nap, he stayed. From then on, he split his time between the harbor and Maggie's warm porch. A dual citizen of land and sea. And the sailor's cap? Still on, slightly frayed, utterly dignified. Captain Whiskers lived to a ripe old age. Nobody ever knew exactly how old. But when he passed, quietly, curled up in his favorite chair under the umbrella, the entire town felt it. The harbor felt it. Even the seagulls were quieter that day. People left flowers, fish bones, handwritten notes. Someone painted a mural on the side of the boat shed. A portrait of him, looking out to sea, cap slightly askew. Beneath it, the harbor boss, always on watch. Years later, children still ask about him. Is it true a cat used to run the harbor? They'd whisper. Their parents smile. He didn't run it, they'd say. He was it. And every now and then, when the fog rolls in just right and the boats creak on the tide, someone swears they catch a glimpse. A soft blur of orange and white, lounging in the sunlight, watching over the sea, just like always, just like Captain Whiskers. Story 2. Brushes of Driftwood. The Girl Who Painted the Sea. Port Townsend, Washington, wasn't the kind of place you'd find in glossy travel brochures. It was quieter, gentler, a town of wind-chapped cheeks and calloused hands, where gulls cried over old rooftops and boats rocked against weathered docks like they were dreaming of the sea. It smelled of salt and fish. And some mornings the mist hung so thick over the water you could barely tell where sky ended and ocean began. And somewhere between all that salt and silence, there was a girl who used to dry squid for a living. Her name was Callie Mae Brooks. Callie grew up in the small wooden house behind the fish market. The one with the paint peeling off the shutters and a garden of wind-blown herbs. Her mama used to scrub floors at the cannery. And her father, well, no one ever talked much about him. Just an old photograph on the dresser and a dusty pair of work boots no one dared to throw out. By the time Callie was 9, she was already helping out at the harbor, cleaning buckets, sorting fish, and laying out rows of squid on metal racks to dry under the midday sun. It was messy, smelly, repetitive work. But Callie never seemed to mind. Because what others saw as scraps and trash, she saw as stories. During her breaks, while the other kids ran down to the shoreline to skip rocks, Callie would wander near the driftwood piles. She'd pick through the scattered planks, wood softened by sea and time, and gather the ones that felt right. She never explained what that meant. Just that some pieces had songs inside them, and she needed to let them out. She didn't have canvas, or brushes, or paint sets with fancy names. What she had were crushed berries, ground up seashells, charcoal from old fire pits, and the yellow-brown ink of squid. Stained fingers were just part of her everyday. With these, she painted, sometimes with her fingers, sometimes with feather tips or bits of sponge she found tangled in seaweed. Her first painting was on the back of a broken oar. It showed the harbor at dusk, the curve of the boats, the fog curling like breath. and a girl sitting on the dock with her knees pulled to her chest. It was crude and unbalanced. The colors bled too much, and the horizon line slanted awkwardly. But it was real, so real, in fact, that when old Mrs. Hanley, the bookshop owner, passed by and saw it leaning beside the drying racks, she stopped in her tracks. "Who made this?" she asked. Callie, who was rinsing a bucket of fish heads, glanced up and said, "Me, ma'am." Mrs. Hanley stared a little longer, then nodded. "You've got a sea soul," she said. "Don't let anyone scrub that away." Those words stayed with Callie, long after the winds changed, long after her knees grew stronger, her fingers more sure, and her paints more daring. She kept painting, on wood, on stones, on bits of netting, even on old shipping crates. People began to notice. Tourists visiting the harbor would ask where they could buy the girl's paintings. Locals started dropping off extra wood at her doorstep. A fisherman named Lou even taught her how to mix pigments from dried seaweed and copper rust, which gave her waves the most haunting green tones. And then one day, everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday in March when a woman in a yellow coat walked into Mrs. Hanley's bookstore. She was an editor for a children's publishing house in Seattle, visiting Port Townsend for a cousin's wedding. She was also, by pure chance, a lover of odd little bookstores and salt-sprayed harbors. And that day, displayed in the front window of the bookshop, was one of Callie's Driftwood paintings, a gray whale rising from a moonlit sea, its shape melting into clouds like a dream dissolving at dawn. The woman bought it on the spot. She also left a note behind. "Would love to talk about book illustrations. You paint stories." Callie didn't know what to think. She was 17. She'd never been to Seattle. She didn't even have a proper email address. Just a shared computer at the library and a flip phone she barely knew how to use. But the next weekend, she boarded the 6:45 ferry with her portfolio wrapped in a scarf and sea wind in her lungs. The meeting went better than she ever imagined. They didn't ask for polished pieces or professional techniques. They asked about the sea, about how she captured its moods, the stillness before a storm, the sun caught in fish scales, the loneliness of a boat on foggy mornings. Callie just shrugged and said, "I grew up listening to it." And that was enough. She got her first illustration job 2 months later, for a children's book called Marina and the Moonfish. Every page bore her signature touch: whales that looked like shadows, coral gardens that glowed, and skies so wide they made you ache a little. The book became a quiet hit. And so did Callie. But she didn't move to the city. She stayed in Port Townsend. She still walked the docks, still picked up driftwood, still smelled like squid on some days. She rented a little blue house closer to the lighthouse, converted the old boat shed into a studio, and hung wind chimes made from oyster shells outside the windows. Children would visit her after school, bringing their own scraps of wood and homemade brushes. Callie never charged them, she just sat beside them, teaching them to listen, to the wind, to the waves, to the paint whispering across the wood. She painted for years, for many books and exhibitions. Her name began appearing in articles, interviews, gallery invites, but she never stopped being Callie from the docks. Now, when you visit Port Townsend, and if you're lucky, you'll see her painting near the nets. A woman in overalls, hair tied with string, kneeling over a piece of driftwood. Still listening, still painting, still part of the sea. Story 3. When the Sea Sends a Letter Back. Claire lived in a small cedar-shingled house on the edge of Ucluelet, a quiet harbor town tucked into the western curve of Vancouver Island. Her front porch faced the sea, not in a grand, cinematic way, just a simple view of rocks, gulls, and a narrow trail that ran behind the trees and disappeared into the coastal mist. She was 25, soft-spoken, and thoughtful in a way that made silences with her feel full rather than empty. She worked part-time at a bookshop tucked near the marina, with sea glass chimes on the door and a handwritten sign that said, "Come in." The kettle's always warm. Most evenings, Claire would return home to her mother, who was equal parts gentle and fussy, and would remind her, like clockwork, to eat more protein, get proper rest, and stop writing letters to no one. But Claire didn't write to no one. She wrote to her father. She never knew exactly what happened to his boat. All she had were fragments, that he'd gone fishing one late summer morning when she was 8. That the storm came sooner than expected, and that the Coast Guard only found a few broken pieces of the hull and one boot. He was never officially declared dead. But the sea had taken him, everyone said, and that was that. Only for Claire, it wasn't. Not when there were still things to say. So she wrote. She wrote about her childhood, about learning to braid her own hair and playing make-believe under the stairs. She wrote about books she loved and the odd dreams she had. And as she grew older, her letters changed. They weren't just updates. They were little windows, ways to remember the man she barely got to know. And maybe, somehow, to bring him back. She rolled each letter carefully, tucked it into a glass bottle, and sealed the top with melted wax. Then she'd wait for the right evening, always a golden one, when the sun was low and the waves gentle. She'd walk to her favorite overlook just beyond the lighthouse trail and, after a deep breath, she'd toss the bottle into the sea like a wish. The last letter had been different. She'd written it the way someone might whisper through a dream. "Dear Dad, today the tide was low and I saw a sea otter playing with a stone. Mom is fine, still nagging me about eating properly. Still folding laundry like it's a competition. I learned how to make pancakes. The kind you used to like. Fluffy ones with cinnamon. Work is slow but peaceful. I shelved 4 copies of a poetry book today that made me cry for no reason. I wish I could read them to you. If I can still believe in miracles, this is my number. Just in case. Love. Claire. Far across the island, in a town called Comox where the beaches were broader and the skies clearer. Ethan was starting his day. At 28, he was the kind of man who looked most at home in salt-stained t-shirts and worn sandals. He lived alone in a modest cabin above the dunes and worked as a lifeguard and shoreline responder. He liked clean air, strong coffee, and the quiet rhythm of the tide. Every week, he walked the beach collecting plastic bottles, old nets, and driftwood. It wasn't part of his job. It just made him feel like he was doing something good. Something that helped. That morning, a glint in the sand caught his eye. A bottle. Smooth and rounded, with something inside. A letter. The paper was damp at the edges. The ink slightly faded. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, curiosity tugged harder. He unrolled the letter. And read. Ethan sat in the sand for a long while after that. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. A message in a bottle usually meant something silly. A dare. A joke. But this was someone's heart. Gently folded and set adrift. He reread it twice. Then walked home in silence. The bottle cradled in both hands. For days, he thought of nothing else. Should he text her? Was it too strange? Too intrusive? He drafted messages and deleted them. Thought of how he'd feel if the roles were reversed. Would she think it romantic or reckless? But the feeling in his chest, the one that whispered, "Don't let this go," grew louder. So, one quiet evening, he sent the message. "Hi. I'm sorry if this is strange. I found your letter on the beach near Comox. I read it, and I couldn't not write back." Claire stared at the message for a long time. Her first instinct was disbelief. Then suspicion. Then, wonder. She replied simply, "How'd I know you're not joking?" He sent a photo of the bottle, the letter, and the beach where he'd found it. The light was different, the horizon unfamiliar, but her letter was real, tangible in someone else's hands. She didn't reply for hours. And then, finally, "I didn't think it'd go that far." What followed was a kind of slow, uncertain unfolding. They didn't flirt. They shared. She told him about her childhood. Her dad's laugh. The small things that hurt and healed. About the sea glass she collected and the way her mom still talked to the cat as if it understood everything. He told her about his long walks. The people he'd helped from the water. The loneliness he never quite admitted to anyone else. He shared his quiet thoughts. His love for trees. The way the sea calmed him and unsettled him all at once. They messaged at odd hours. Sometimes they'd stop mid-conversation and not return for a day. But each time they did, it was easy, like picking up a stone they'd dropped and finding it still warm. One day, Claire wrote, "I used to think the ocean was a graveyard, a place that held my father's last breath. But maybe it's also a messenger, a bridge, a memory keeper." And Ethan wrote back, "Maybe it's both. Maybe that's what makes it sacred." Months passed. Then one day, Claire booked a week off work. She told her mom she was going to see the other side of the sea. She took the ferry, then a bus, and finally walked the last bit of the way. Ethan met her by the boardwalk. His hair was messier than she imagined. Her smile was quieter than he expected. They didn't hug at first. They just stood for a moment, eyes searching, and then, like waves settling into shore, they began to walk. That evening, they sat by the beach, shoulders just barely touching. Claire looked at the sea, blinking into the dusk. "I've written him every month for 17 years," she said, "and maybe, just maybe, this is the first time the sea wrote back." A year later, they were still writing letters. But now, Claire read them aloud before sealing the bottles. And Ethan would smile, listening, like he was standing at the edge of something ancient and kind. He once told her, "I used to feel lost in front of the ocean, like I was looking for something I didn't know the name of. But then you came along. And now I think maybe I've found my direction. I know I'll never be your father. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be the place you can always come home to." Story 4. Where Crabs Sip the Sunset. Tucked beneath the rustling fronds of a coconut grove on Christmas Island, off the northwestern coast of Australia, stood a tiny wooden cafe with a roof of thatched palm leaves and the smell of sea breeze in its walls. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't loud, but every afternoon, as the sunlight melted into the ocean, something magical stirred near its porch. It was called the Crab Café, and the crabs came. The cafe itself was barely the size of a cottage, built almost entirely from reclaimed driftwood and leftover fishing pallets. Each plank bore a different shade of salt-washed gray, and the corners still smelled faintly of coconut oil and roasted beans. The front sign, carved by hand, featured a cartoon of a coconut crab, smiling with one claw holding a coffee cup and the other gripping a whole coconut. But the true icon stood right beside the front steps, a massive sculpture of a bright red crab, almost as tall as the building itself, with googly eyes and an open claw where tourists loved to sit for selfies. No one came to the island without taking a photo with Big Clawsy. Inside, the cafe glowed with warm light and warm people. The ceiling had wind chimes made from seashells and dried seed pods. Tables wore hand-stitched cloths patterned with, you guessed it, red crabs holding spoons or waving tiny flags. Even the mugs had crab prints on the side and cheeky messages like, "Strong like a coconut crab," or "Don't get crabby before coffee." Marley, the owner and heart of the cafe, wore her hair tied in a messy bun and always had a flower tucked behind her ear. She had opened the Crab Cafe 5 years ago after falling in love with the island during a scuba trip. 1 cup of local coconut coffee and a crab sighting later. She never looked back. Marley would always say, "This isn't just a cafe. It's a slow afternoon in a cup." She had a gift for making people feel like they'd always belonged. Locals, travelers, sunburned backpackers, quiet writers, they all found a home in the little shack by the sea. But even Marley would tell you, the real magic began when the crabs came. Each evening, just as the sun leaned low over the Indian Ocean, the coconut crabs, those large, ancient-looking creatures, would emerge from the shadows of the nearby rainforest. They were magnificent, their shells glistened reddish-orange, their legs thick and purposeful, and their claws strong enough to crack open a coconut in minutes. Marley had once spilled her espresso the first time she saw it. "Thought I was hallucinating," she'd laugh. There it was, crack, as if it were just opening a soda can. Guests at the Crab Cafe would often leave their tables to watch from a respectful distance, sipping iced tea or passionfruit cake while whispering in awe. Signs were placed around the area in wooden stakes. "Crab, please don't touch the red crabs. Shell, they're wild. They're sacred. They're older than all of us." Some people laughed at the wording. Others took it to heart. But everyone stopped to look. One morning, a little boy named Luca came to the cafe with his older sister, who had brought him along on her research trip. Luca was 7, shy, and absolutely terrified of anything that moved sideways. He clutched his toy whale and refused to step onto the deck when he saw a sign with a cartoon crab on it. Marley noticed right away. She didn't say much, just brought over a glass of mango juice and a small pin shaped like a smiling crab. "Here," she said gently, clipping it to Luca's shirt. "This one's friendly. He only pinches mean coconuts." Luca looked skeptical, but as the day unfolded, he began to relax. He sat at a table under the big umbrella, watched his sister sketch birds, and occasionally peeked at the sand where the crabs would come later. By sunset, he was sitting silently, wide-eyed, sketching something in his notebook. When he was done, he walked up to Marley, held out the drawing, a coconut crab eating a coconut, and whispered, "For the wall." It hung near the register from that day on, in a little frame made of twigs and glue. There was a special corner in the cafe called the Crab Corner. It wasn't big, just a small shelf and wooden display beside the window. But it was always filled with handcrafted souvenirs. Recycled keychains shaped like crab claws. T-shirts showing cartoon crabs surfing with slogans like "Stay Shellfish." Notebooks with pages made from recycled paper and covers that read, "Write like a crab, sideways but strong." Woven pouches shaped like coconuts with smiling eyes. Next to it was a wooden box painted blue with a tiny roof and a slot on top. A handwritten label said, "Leave a message for the crabs." People left poems, doodles, thank you notes, confessions of broken hearts, and promises to protect the ocean. Marley never opened them, she just let them sit, like soft whispers resting on paper. Then one afternoon, the skies changed. A soft drizzle came from nowhere. Warm, gentle, more like a blessing than a storm. Customers hurried inside, laughing, umbrellas dripping, shoes squeaking against the bamboo floor. Marley handed out towels. Someone lit a sandalwood candle, and soon everyone settled under the wide porch, watching the rain ripple across the ocean. And out on the beach, the crabs were still there, unafraid, calm. They moved slowly, methodically, dragging bits of leaf and cracked coconuts back toward their burrows. The raindrops clung to their shells like tiny glass beads. A little girl leaned on her father's shoulder and whispered, "They don't mind the rain." And no one said anything else for a while. Because it was true, and because it was beautiful. Later that evening, as people packed up and walked back to the forest lodges or the ferry docks, Marley waved them off with smiles and reusable bags. Some took home little tokens from Crab Corner. Others carried only pictures, but most of all, they took with them something unspoken. Maybe it was the slowness of the moment. Maybe it was the gentle way nature had reminded them to be still. Or maybe it was the crab-shaped sticker now stuck to their water bottle, reminding them that not all wild things are scary. And some just want to be left alone to enjoy their coconuts in peace. As the final rays of sun slid behind the curve of the sea, Marley stood outside with a broom in one hand and a papaya popsicle in the other. A crab ambled past her foot, paused, and looked up, just for a second. She grinned. Evening. Clausy. She took a deep breath, smelling salt, wood smoke, and hibiscus, then whispered, maybe to the crab, maybe to no one in particular. May the world always leave room for tiny miracles like you. And if you ever find yourself on Christmas Island, sipping coffee near a painted crab, remember, if you see a red crab moving slowly beneath the trees, you're standing where nature still whispers back. Story 5: The Light That Never Left. At the edge of the cliffs in western France, where the Atlantic wind smells of salt and thyme, There stood a red and white lighthouse that never slept. Its light turned slowly, steadily, across the sea, casting long arcs of gold into the darkness. The fishermen of the small village below called it La Veilleuse, the Watcher. They said it had never gone out. Not even once. Beneath that watchful light, nestled against the rocks like a secret, lay the village of Port Lumiere, a sleepy cluster of stone houses with red-tiled roofs and garden fences strung with drying nets. There were always gulls overhead. Children played barefoot near the docks, and the scent of wood smoke and stew drifted from chimneys as the sun dipped behind the hills. And every morning, at the same hour, an old man named Marceau Belleris rode his squeaky bicycle down to the market. He wore the same cap he had worn for 30 years. With a tear near the brim, he greeted the baker with a nod, the grocer with a small joke, and the postman with a polite bonjour, though they all knew he preferred silence to small talk. What he did speak to, what he loved without question, was the lighthouse. Marceau had lived at its base since he was a boy. His father had once been keeper of the light. He remembered the day, vividly still, when his father, stern and weather-worn, placed a hand on the lighthouse door and said, "As long as this light shines, ships will find their way. But if it goes out, someone may never come home." He was 7 years old, but he understood. Even now, 65 years later, Marceau still touched the door each morning. He lived alone, in a small stone house built against the lighthouse's foundation. The roof creaked in storms. The walls were lined with books, framed photographs, and small glass bottles of sand from different shores. In the windowsill sat Cannelle, his fat and opinionated cat, who'd once clawed a tourist's backpack for smelling too strongly of sardines. The days passed slowly in Port Lumiere, and Marceau liked it that way. In the mornings, he watered his flower pots and adjusted the weather vane. In the afternoons, he repaired shutters for neighbors or scribbled tide notes in a leather-bound logbook. And as the sun leaned toward evening, he climbed the spiral staircase of the lighthouse, step by step, until he reached the lantern room. He polished the lenses, checked the fuel, cleaned the brass handles, and then, with hands that never trembled despite his age, he switched on the light, always 5 minutes before dusk. It was his ritual, his promise, his prayer. His wife, Eloise, had once called it his church. She had been the only one who ever climbed the tower with him. They had grown up chasing gulls and skipping stones, shared sandwiches by the cliffs, and married without fuss beneath a sycamore tree behind the chapel. In the evenings, Eloise made tea and waited by the kitchen window for him to return from the tower. She would wave with one hand, a teacup in the other, and even when she fell ill, growing slower, quieter, more bone than breath, she still asked him every night, "Did the light go on?" "Of course," he would whisper, "it never misses." She passed away one October morning, curled beneath a quilt she'd sewn herself, while the kettle still hummed on the stove. Her shawl still hung on the back of her chair. He never moved it. Their sons, Matthew and Luke, had built lives far from the coast. Matthew worked in Lyon as an architect. Luke lived near Bordeaux, managing logistics for shipping routes. Ironically, never by sea. They came back once or twice a year, always bearing gifts, new coats, medicines, electric gadgets Marceau never used. During one visit, as they shared cider in the courtyard, Matthew cleared his throat. "Papa, you know you don't have to do this forever." Luke chimed in. "We can bring you to the city. Better care. A proper bed. You'd never be alone." Marceau looked at the lighthouse. Then he smiled, gently, as if their suggestion was a funny misunderstanding. "I wouldn't know what to do in a place where the buildings don't breathe." "What do you mean? Here, even the stones have voices. And the lighthouse, it still remembers me." They said nothing after that. They hugged him longer that night. And when they left, they paused at the foot of the tower, touched its door, and didn't ask again. The lighthouse remained. Each night, its beam turned like a heartbeat over the water. Sometimes, travelers wandered up from the beach and found Marceau sitting in his chair beside the lighthouse door, sipping tea and reading poetry with cannelle on his lap. They asked if the lighthouse was open to visitors. "No," he would say politely. "She's shy." Others simply watched the light from afar, unsure whether it was real or just a relic. But one summer, a little girl named Camille, visiting from Paris with her grandmother, marched right up and asked, "Monsieur, why don't you retire?" Marceau chuckled. "And who would keep the light for the ones at sea? But can't it run by itself?" "Maybe, but it wouldn't feel the same." She squinted at him. "Feel what?" Marceau lowered his voice, like sharing a secret. "There are some things in life that can't be left to machines. Like keeping a promise, or waiting for someone to come home." Camille seemed to think about that for a long time. Then she came back the next day with a seashell. "For the lighthouse," she said. Then, one autumn evening, the wind changed. It started with soft clouds. Nothing unusual, but by midnight, the village was swallowed in a storm unlike any in years. Rain beat against rooftops like a drumline. The sea roared. Power flickered, then died. Every house went dark, except the lighthouse. From its perch on the cliff, it glowed like a sentinel. Its beam swept through the fog, clear and calm. Far offshore, a small fishing boat, returning late with a broken radio, saw the light just in time to steer away from a hidden reef. Back in the village, people lit candles and huddled near windows, watching the only light that never failed. By morning, the rain had stopped. The village was wet, shaken, grateful, and without any announcement, people began to gather in front of the lighthouse. Some brought fresh bread, others carried wine, jam, or wildflowers. No one knocked. No one gave a speech. They just left their offerings at the lighthouse steps. Marceau opened the door and found them all. Silent tokens of thanks. He wiped his eyes with the corner of Eloise's old shawl and whispered, "She still watches, doesn't she?" Cannelle meowed in agreement. Years passed, and the lighthouse kept shining. Marceau never missed a night. On mornings when the sea was still, he'd sit on the stone steps with his notebook, writing notes about waves, birds, or thoughts that drifted like clouds. The villagers always said, "As long as the light shines, Marceau is with us." And one spring morning, the light turned on at dusk. But Marceau didn't come down. They found him still in the lantern room, sitting peacefully in the chair by the glass, his cap on his chest, the lamp glowing beside him, his notes resting on his knees. There was no storm that night, only a quiet sky, and a village that stood a little stiller than usual. They buried him beside Eloise, in the wildflower meadow behind the chapel. Luke carved a small plaque from driftwood. Matthew asked the village carpenter to etch a sign and place it at the base of the lighthouse. It read, "This light was kept by a man who asked for no thanks." Only that someone, somewhere, could find their way home. The lighthouse still shines, every night, and in Port Lumiere, the people still say, some lights burn because they must, but others, because someone loved enough never to let them go out. Story 6. The Coconut Stand with No Price Tag. On the island of Maui, where the palms sway in rhythm with the sea breeze and the mornings begin with the scent of plumeria, there stood a little coconut stand beneath the shade of two old palm trees. There was no vendor, no cashier, no price tags, just a hand-painted sign that read, "Aloha every day, take what you need, leave with a smile," and beneath it, a table made from driftwood and kindness. The stand offered fresh coconuts, sliced and chilled in a cooler box. Homemade banana chips in tiny bags with handwritten notes. Woven palm leaf hats, soft and still smelling of green. Shell necklaces strung on simple twine. And on some days, tiny origami cranes folded from dried mango leaves. It wasn't a business. It was a gift. And behind it all were two hearts who never asked for anything in return. Their names were Henry and Lonnie Kaleo. They were in their mid-60s, though no one ever guessed it right. Lonnie's laughter made her seem younger, and Henry's beard made him look like an island Santa who traded his sleigh for a surfboard. They lived just a short walk from the beach, in a small wooden house with green shutters and wind chimes made from cutlery and shells. You could always smell coconut cake from their window, and you could always hear music. soft ukulele in the evenings. Henry's old radio humming Hawaiian classics in the mornings. They had no children, no expectations, just each other, and the ocean. They used to say that the sea had raised them. Henry grew up casting nets with his father before school. Lonnie spent her teenage years combing the tide pools with her grandmother, learning the names of every shell and seaweed strand. They met in their 20s. Henry teaching at the elementary school. Lonnie working in the garden behind the library. They married quietly, barefoot on the sand. No tuxedo, no cake. Just a circle of friends, a garland of flowers, and the promise to love simply, fully, and every day. They worked hard for years, saved wisely, never spent much, and when retirement finally came, they chose not to travel the world, but to stay rooted. The ocean has already brought the world to us, Henry once said. One spring, after a long walk by the shore, Lonnie turned to Henry with a coconut in hand and said, "What if we just gave things away?" He blinked. Like what? Coconuts, snacks, hats, little things. Just joy, but in edible or wearable form. He laughed, and the next morning, he built a table. That's how the stand was born. Every day after sunrise, Henry and Lonnie would roll their cart down the sandy trail, unpack their items with care, and leave them on the wooden counter under the sign. Then they'd walk back home, have breakfast, and spend the day like always, reading, baking, gardening, or picking up bits of trash along the shoreline. They never waited to see who came. But oh, how many people did. Tourists, joggers, parents with sticky-fingered toddlers, surfers stopping for a cold sip, seniors collecting seashell necklaces for their grandkids, teenagers who rolled their eyes, then walked away wearing palm hats. No one was watching, and that, perhaps, was why they smiled more. Henry and Lonnie kept a little notebook at home, not for profits, there were none, but for stories. They wrote down what they saw from afar. Little girl tried to pay with a candy wrapper. Left a drawing of a turtle. Japanese honeymooners took matching necklaces. Took a selfie. Bowed. Boy with skateboard left a seashell and a thank you rock. Lonnie cried. Sometimes people left notes tucked beneath a coconut. Thank you for this gift. I was having a hard day. You reminded me of my grandparents. I want to do this too. Someday. Henry would fold them into tiny boats. Lonnie would float them in a bowl on their porch. They called it their sea of gratitude. One morning, a young woman named Kira came jogging by. She had just moved to Maui for work. Stressed, alone, unsure, she spotted the stand and stopped out of curiosity. She took a coconut, then paused. She walked back and noticed a small shell ornament shaped like a heart. Tied to it was a tiny card that read, "You are loved, even when you don't feel it. Aloha every day." Kira sat down on the bench nearby and cried. then smiled, then took out her phone and shared a photo. It went viral. The next week, a local news crew came by. They waited until Henry and Lonnie arrived to refill the stand and asked if they could interview them. Lonnie smiled shyly. Henry rubbed his neck and chuckled. "We're just doing what makes our hearts full," he said. "That's really all there is to it." They never expected the attention. But what came next was beautiful. People started leaving gifts in return. Books, flowers, postcards from far away. Others began setting up their own versions. A kindness cart in Honolulu, a share table in Kauai, and even a free fruit fence in a neighborhood across the island. Some brought trash bags to clean the beach. Some left hand-woven bracelets to add to the display. The ripple had begun. But for Henry and Lonnie, nothing really changed. They still rose with the sun, still brewed their coffee slow, still held hands on their evening walk. And every morning, they opened their notebook and added a new line. Tuesday, woman with camera took only one thing, the little shell with the word, hope, on it. Left a pink hibiscus behind. One rainy afternoon, a child with bright eyes and bare feet ran up to the stand. He looked around, found no one, and grabbed a bag of banana chips. But before he left, he placed his toy car on the corner of the table and whispered, "Thank you, coconut people." Lonnie saw it from the window. She giggled for days. Years passed. The sign faded. The table aged. But the love never did. Henry's hands grew slower, and Lonnie's eyes needed thicker glasses. But still, they kept the stand going. Not because they had to, but because something in them knew. Kindness, once started, wants to keep walking. And when one day, Henry fell ill, Lonnie sat by his side every night, reading aloud the notebook they'd kept over the years. He listened with a tired smile. "Do you think," he whispered, "they'll still take the coconuts when we're gone?" Lonnie held his hand and kissed his forehead. "They will, because you never needed to be here for them to feel your aloha." He passed quietly one dawn, the ocean singing soft through the trees. And that morning, the notebook stayed open on the porch, fluttering in the wind. Lonnie still kept the stand, still watered the little plant beside it, still wrote in the notebook, now with 2 hearts inside her. And one day, a young couple asked her why she still did it. Even now, she simply said, "Because someone, somewhere, might need to feel loved today." And if you ever walk the sandy path by Halau Cove, look for the 2 palm trees and a weathered sign. Take what you need, leave with a smile, and maybe, just maybe, leave a note behind, because love, like coconuts and kindness, was never meant to be kept, only shared.
Story 7. The Ring Beneath the Reef. There are places in the world where silence feels sacred, where the sea moves with a hush so gentle, it almost sounds like someone exhaling after telling the truth. Vallau was one of those places, a small island in the Bohuslän archipelago off Sweden's western coast. It wasn't marked on most tourist maps. The locals called it the Quiet Jewel. Red-roofed cottages dotted its shoreline, and the seabed surrounding the island hid coral reefs that shimmered beneath the cold. Clear water, and it was there, among the gentle sway of eelgrass and sunlight slipping through waves, that Andreas Lindholm lost his engagement ring. Andreas had planned everything, the rented yacht, the champagne, the exact moment at sunset when he'd kneel and offer a white gold ring to the young woman he barely knew. It was all perfectly arranged, except the wind. A sudden gust rocked the boat just as he pulled the velvet box from his pocket. The ring box slipped from his hand, bounced once, and disappeared into the blue below. He stood frozen, staring over the railing, heart pounding louder than the waves. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then the woman, Annika, laughed, a sound too light for the heaviness in Andreas's chest. "Maybe it's a sign," she said. He looked at her. She wasn't upset, not even disappointed, just tired, and that was when he knew. Later, seated on the dock, their feet dangling above the water, Andreas finally spoke. "Annika, there's something I need to tell you." She nodded, waiting, and he said it, not easily, but honestly, that he was gay, that he hadn't had the courage to say it, not even to himself, that the engagement had been a performance, one driven by family pressure, business ties, and the fear of disappointing everyone but himself. He braced for her anger. Instead, she reached over and touched his hand gently. "Andreas, I think we both knew this wasn't love. I'm sorry, so am I, but mostly, I'm relieved." They both laughed, not because it was funny, but because relief has its own kind of joy. Annika left the island the next morning. Andreas stayed. He told his staff to postpone all meetings. He switched off his phone. He sat alone on the beach, his expensive shoes half buried in the sand, staring out at the horizon and wondering what to do next. That evening, the sea was calm, the reef whispered, and the next day, it whispered back. He was sitting on a rock when a shadow fell across him. He looked up. A man stood there in a wetsuit, salt still drying in his hair, a snorkel mask pushed up on his forehead. In his hand, he held a small velvet box. Andreas blinked. "Is that? Found it in the reef?" The man said, holding it out, almost thought it was a joke. "You don't usually find things like this down there." Andreas took it, opening the box slowly. The ring sparkled, untouched, as if nothing had happened. "I dropped it yesterday. I figured you look like someone who would carry a ring box on a yacht." Andreas chuckled, then flushed. Well, not anymore. The man smiled. I'm Emil. I live here. They talked for a while. Awkwardly at first, Andreas felt like a fish out of water, overdressed and unsure. Emil, on the other hand, seemed as if he belonged to the island itself, tanned from sun, quiet in the way that meant he listened before he spoke. He asked no probing questions. He simply pointed to the water and said, "Have you ever gone diving?" Andreas shook his head. "I don't even swim much." Emil's grin widened. "That's about to change." The next morning, Andreas showed up in board shorts he had borrowed from the guest house. His hair still tousled with confusion. Emil handed him a mask and flippers. "We're starting with snorkeling." The water was cold but startlingly clear. Emil guided him gently, showing him how to breathe, how to float, how to let go of fear. And when Andreas dipped his head below the surface and saw the reef for the first time, its soft pulses of color, its dance of tiny fish, it felt like something inside him had opened. He didn't think of legacy. He didn't think of family. He didn't think of fear. He just breathed. They spent hours in the water, then sat on the rocks eating strawberries Emil had brought in a woven bag. Andreas told him everything about his family's company, about being the only son, about the pressure to be perfect, straight, married, about how he had practiced a smile that looked real, about how he had almost gone through with it, and about the moment the ring fell. "I think the sea saved me," Andreas whispered. Emil didn't say anything. He simply took Andreas's hand and held it, quietly, until the sun dipped low. In the days that followed, something grew between them, not rushed, not loud, but real. They swam every morning, explored tide pools, talked late into the night. Andreas learned to make coffee the island way, dark and strong. Emil shared stories of shipwrecks and storms, of coral that took decades to grow, and of love that should never be rushed. And one evening, as they sat by the fire, Andreas said, "I want to tell my parents." Emil looked at him. "Are you ready?" "No, but I don't want to be afraid forever." The conversation with his family wasn't easy. His mother cried. His father stayed silent for a long time. But Andreas stood his ground. He told them about the engagement, the truth, Emil, the reef, the peace he had found on Valhalla. He told them he wasn't sorry, only late, but not anymore. It took time, but time, like coral, can shape even the hardest surfaces. His parents didn't change overnight, but they softened, asked questions. Slowly, they began to accept. Andreas returned to the city with something different in his eyes. He worked, yes, but no longer as a mask. He came back to Valhalla every chance he got, and Emil was always there. 3 years later, they were married, not in a castle or cathedral, but barefoot on the rocks, just above the reef. Only 20 guests, strawberry cake, and a ring that had once been lost but now found its rightful place. They live in a house by the sea now, part-time in Gothenburg, part-time on Vallau, and every morning Andreas walks to the edge of the reef, breathing in the salt and sunlight, remembering not the day the ring fell, but the day he found himself. Thank you for spending time with us and listening to these little stories. Most people go searching for miracles in fairy tales, but often the most magical things are hidden in the tiniest corners of everyday life. We hope these stories have planted a small, bright seed in your heart, one that might grow into something beautiful and kind. If you enjoyed these quiet moments with us, don't forget to like and subscribe to Dreamer's Realm. We'll be waiting for you in the next video with more stories to whisper into your soul. See you again very soon.